My name is Don Baker. I am a professor of Korean civilization in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of British Columbia in Canada. I was born and raised in the United States, but I moved to Canada in 1987 to establish the first Korean studies program on Canada's west coast. So I carry both an American, US, and a Canadian passport, but I also call myself a Gwangju person. Now, why? I do not look like someone who was born in Gwangju, so why would I call myself a Gwangju person? The reason is clear to everyone who knows me. The years I spent living in Gwangju as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer from 1971 to 1974, and what I witnessed in Gwangju in May 1980, changed me and made me what I am today. My experiences in Gwangju are the core of my identity and shaped the values that have guided my life since I arrived in Gwangju in September 1971, almost half a century ago. In the early 70s, I spent 2 years teaching English at Dongshin Middle School in Gwangju, followed by 1 year working with the Chollonamdo Provincial Board of Education to enhance English language education in the southwestern corner of Korea. Over those 3 years, I fell in love with Korea in general and with Gwangju in particular. It wasn't just the delicious food in Gwangju that stole my heart. I also made many friends in Gwangju, including the family that I lived with for most of those 3 years that I served as a Peace Corps volunteer. I enjoyed living in Gwangju so much that I decided to devote my life to things Korean. When I left Gwangju in 1974, I moved to the U.S. to earn a PhD in Korean history at the University of Washington. In pursuit of that goal, I returned to Korea in late 1978 for doctoral dissertation research. However, I was then based in Seoul because that was where most of the documents I needed to read were housed. That's why I was in Seoul rather than in Gwangju on May 18, 1980. On the morning of May 18, I learned that General Chun Doo-hwan had carried out a military coup the evening before, dissolving parliament, canceling planned elections, jailing hundreds of journalists, professors, students, and other pro-democracy advocates, and imposing military rule over the entire country. A few hours later, I began to hear disturbing rumors about violence in the city I'd come to call my Korean hometown. Gwangju, I quickly learned, was the only city in Korea that was openly protesting Chun's coup. I also learned they were paying a price for their dedication to democracy. They were being attacked by their own army. The press in Seoul was censored, so I turned to shortwave radio to learn from journalists outside of Korea what was going on inside Korea. Every day the news I heard made me more and more concerned about my friends in Gwangju. I finally decided to go down there to see for myself if they were okay. I left Seoul on May 26th. All the roads in the Gwangju were blocked by the military, so I had to go around Gwangju and spend the night in the coastal town of Haenam. Early on the morning of May 27, I learned that the violence was over and that the resistance to Chun's coup had been crushed. That made me more determined to go there and check on my friends. So I grabbed a rural bus heading towards Gwangju. I was already deeply concerned about what I would see when I got there. But my concern grew when the bus passed through an intersection near Naju on the outskirts of Gwangju. On the side of the road near that intersection, I saw 3 passenger buses which were lying on their side. I believe there were 3 of them. I didn't take notes, so I can't be sure. Those buses appeared to be full of bullet holes and also had what appeared to be burn marks. The bus I was on couldn't stop, so I was unable to confirm that quick impression. I can tell you, though, that I did not see any dead bodies in or around those buses. There must have been some people killed there earlier, but they had been removed by the time my bus drove past that scene. The army still had the roads into Gwangju blocked, so the bus had to stop outside of town. I had to walk into Gwangju over a mountain path, following a line of elderly women carrying sorely needed bags of rice into that city. Gwangju needed that rice because it had been cut off from the rest of Korea for 10 days. When I arrived in Gwangju, I headed downtown to the area where I used to live. That's where I saw a sight I will never forget. There was a long line of grandmothers waiting to enter the gymnasium across from what then was the provincial capitol building. They were waiting their turn to go inside to see if they could identify a child or grandchild among the many bodies that had been picked up off the streets of Gwangju in the aftermath of military attacks. So many people had been killed between May 18th and May 27th that a gymnasium had to be turned into a temporary morgue. To get to that part of Gwangju, I had to walk past fully armed soldiers on every downtown street corner. I also had to walk past citizens of Gwangju trying to clean the streets of the debris of 10 days of violence, including what looked to me like bloodstains on the ground. Though I was in a state of shock at what I was seeing, I continued to walk around downtown to see if I could learn more about what had happened. I tried talking with people I encountered to learn more about this tragic event. I talked to one young woman who told me that she lived in an apartment above a shop on Chungjang-no, the main shopping district in Gwangju at that time. She told me that not long after the violence started, her husband heard a disturbance on the street below and opened a window to stick his head out and see what was going on. A soldier saw him, felt threatened, and shot him, killing him instantly. Wandering around a back alley on the other side of Kumnan-no, the main street of Gwangju then, I saw a cart holding a wooden coffin it was taking to a temporary cemetery on the outskirts of town. An older woman was chasing after that cart, screaming, "Son, don't leave me. Don't leave me, son." Onlookers told me he had been a university student in Seoul who had returned home when Chunduan closed all the universities there. Because he was a young man, soldiers thought he might be a protester, so they killed him. I finally found the family I'd lived with 7 years earlier. They had moved to a new house. Their new home was right behind the old provincial capitol building, which was the site of the last battle between Gwangju's small citizen militia and Chun's troops. My former landlady told me she heard that last battle. The sound of single-shot rifles firing, then screaming, then the sound of automatic weapons, and then silence. Fortunately, neither she nor any members of her family were physically hurt, though of course they were traumatized by what they saw and heard. There was one more experience from the 2 days I spent in Gwangju in May 1980 that I will never forget. I talked with a middle-aged man who told me that he had heard the voice of a young woman around 4:30 or 5 in the morning on May 27th, when the army was beginning its final assault. She was driving through the streets of downtown Gwangju, using a speaker on the roof of a sound truck to call out, "Citizens of Gwangju, come to the provincial capitol building and save the students. Please save the students." But, he told me, he was too afraid to leave his house and was unable to help them. As he told me this, his eyes filled with tears, and he confessed that he was ashamed that he'd been such a coward. I told him he was not a coward, that there was nothing he could have done to stop the advance of 20,000 armed soldiers. Korean men do not often cry in public, especially in the presence of strangers. To see such emotion in someone who normally would not let his guard down that way was another reminder of how traumatic those 10 days of May 1980 were for the people of Gwangju. I had to return to Seoul, but before I left Gwangju, I stopped by a hospital run by American medical missionaries, the Gwangju Christian Hospital. There I was told about a young woman who had come to the hospital to donate blood. When she was getting a ride back downtown in the hospital jeep, a bullet from overhead tore into her brain, killing her instantly. I heard this from the doctor who had drawn her blood and then a short while later had identified her corpse. While I was at the hospital, Reverend Charles Huntley gave me x-rays which he said were evidence that Chun's troops had used soft-shell bullets against civilians in Gwangju. He asked me to smuggle those x-rays to Seoul, which I did. Soft-shell bullets are bullets which shatter on impact with the human body, making it difficult for doctors to remove them and repair the damage they do. They are illegal in war, but are not outlawed for domestic use, despite the horrible effect they have on people shot with such bullets. I was almost caught trying to smuggle those x-rays of soft-shell bullet wounds out of the city. To leave Gwangju, I had to cross army lines and get on a country bus. That bus had to pass through several army roadblocks on the way to Seoul. At the first stop, a soldier started to check my bag, the bag that held the x-rays. But his commander told him to leave the foreigner's bag alone. But that was not the most unpleasant experience I had on that roadblock. The soldiers told all the young men to get off the bus and then told us to leave without them. I still remember the dazed look in the eyes of those young men as they stepped off that bus into the waiting arms of soldiers. And I still feel guilty about leaving them behind. When I finally reached Seoul, I handed over those smuggled x-rays to a missionary who promised to find a way to send them to Washington, D.C., so that the U.S. government could see what their South Korean ally was doing. Then I did something that was even more risky. Somehow I'd obtained a copy of a poem by Kim Jun-tae about the terrible events of May 1980. That poem, O Gwangju, the Cross of Our Nation, is a heart-wrenching description of the price people in Gwangju paid for their dedication to democracy. It contains lines like, "Where was our son killed and buried? Where does our daughter lie dead?" I took my copy of that poem to the library on the U.S. Army base in downtown Seoul, made dozens of photocopies of it, and then began leaving it on the seats of city buses all over Seoul. I wanted the people of Seoul to learn what the censors in Seoul didn't want them to learn, what had happened to their countrymen down south in Gwangju. But I also knew what I was doing was dangerous. I realized I could not stay in Korea much longer without endangering myself, but more important, endangering any Korean friends with whom I shared what I'd seen and learned. I left Korea in late June 1980, and moved to Japan to continue my research in libraries there. I waited until Chun Do-hwan was no longer in power before I returned to Korea to do some more research. This is my Gwangju story. When I was leaving Gwangju in May 1980, several people grabbed my arm and pleaded with me to tell the outside world what had happened to them. As a professor of Korean history, I've been able to do that. I've been able to share this story with hundreds of students over the more than 3 decades I've been teaching. Among those students have been many Korean Canadians who did not know the full story of what had happened in the country of their parents and grandparents. I tell my students how proud I am of the people of Gwangju. They stood up for democracy when no one else in Korea dared to do that. Though their initial protest was crushed by brute military force, the fact that South Korea is a vibrant democracy today is to a large part due to the blood shed by the brave people of Gwangju. That blood fertilized the sturdy tree of democracy we see blossoming on Korean soil in the 21st century. Once the rest of Korea learned about the brutality wielded to crush the protest in Gwangju, they woke up to the need for a government that respects those it governs. In 1987, we saw the streets of Seoul filled with people demanding democracy, just as the people in Gwangju had done in 1980. But this time, the government had to back down, and Korea began leaving dictatorship behind. I am forever grateful to the people of Gwangju, not just for teaching me to love Korea, but also for contributing so much to the democratization of Korea. And I am grateful for having the opportunity to share with you what Gwangju taught me about the importance of democracy and human rights. We must never let an event like May 18 happen again. If we all work together to ensure that democracy triumphs over dictatorship and that human rights are respected everywhere, we can make sure we never see another tragedy like Gwangju witnessed in May 1980.